Yeah, so it's a pleasure to be here today with you, with my colleague Jessie. And we will take you through an introduction of the ILO's work on ensuring fair recruitment for migrant workers. So I'm going to share my screen, and Jessie and I will share the presentation. We have a couple of questions to you during the presentation that you can answer in the chat box and through another app. Miriam will guide you. And then we hope to leave enough time for some Q&A as well at the end. So let me get started and share my screen. Maybe Fernando, you can just give me a thumbs up that you can see it. Yes, okay, great. Right, so the objectives of our session are to introduce you to fair recruitment and a little bit the context of why fair recruitment is such an important part of our work on labour migration governance. We also want to introduce you to ILO's guidance and standards on fair recruitment. This is the general principles and operational guidelines that I will talk about, and also the definition of recruitment fees and related costs that Jessie will introduce. And then we'll finish with one of the operational arms of the Fair Recruitment Initiative, if you wish, which is the indicator for the Sustainable Development Goal, indicator 1071, which measures recruitment fees and related costs that workers have to pay. We'll finish thus far some of the important stats we have on migrant workers. 258 million international migrants, 160 million of those are in search for work, so they are migrant workers, and the majority of those are finding work in low-skilled sectors. And most of this, most of the predominant way that workers find these jobs abroad is through a labour recruiter. A labour recruiter can be quite broadly defined. A labour recruiter is an informal labour recruiter, meaning that they could be a village chief, a family member, some other kind of connection via social networks. And a labour recruiter can also be a much more formal business, whether that's a small business recruiter or one of the larger recruiters that we see globally, such as Manpower Group or Adecco. This is what we mean by a labour recruiter who facilitates this intermediation between the employer and the worker. In terms of formal recruiters, estimates that are now quite old indicate that we have around 260,000 private employment agencies worldwide. So this is in fact a huge number. Of course, this number was taken before COVID-19 had impacted the labour recruitment industry. So those numbers may well have changed. And then a final figure I want to introduce to you, which is just symbolic of the challenges that we face when we talk about fair recruitment, is that the ILO has estimated that up to $10 billion in illegal recruitment fees are collected annually from migrant workers. So that is a huge number. And again, that number was taken, estimated some years ago. So we can only assume that this number has increased as the number of migrant workers has increased and as the number of labour recruiters worldwide has increased. And so one of our key goals of ensuring fair recruitment is that that money stays in the hands of the migrant workers rather than the illegal actors along the chain or actors doing collecting illegal fees. The only other number I didn't mention is that 40% of women are migrants. There's, of course, a gender dimension to keep in mind. Women often have less, more restricted access to formal recruitment channels or formal channels to migrate regularly. Okay, that's a little bit the context of what we're operating in. I also wanted to give an overview of why we think fair recruitment matters, and that is because it poses challenges to all actors involved. Recruitment is a labour market act, so we need to consider the perspective of the worker, the government regulators and policy implementers, but also the employers and the recruiters themselves. So in terms of the challenges faced by workers during the recruitment process, these are largely related to protection challenges that workers faced. So they are often charged recruitment fees, and Jessie will go into just how much workers can be charged in some instances. They may face deceptions in regards to the contracts they are offered, the salary that are offered, the actual nature of the job, and also the actual working and living conditions. Once they arrive in their place of employment, or even during the recruitment process and their journey, they might face restrictions on freedom of movement and also have their identity documents, such as passports, retrained. And we do, in some instances, see falsification of papers so that children are recruited on the basis of having papers of having being the age at which they can be recruited. In most countries, this is 18. And they may also be recruited into hazardous forms of work. The kind of challenges that governments face are on the regulatory side, so ensuring that an effective regulatory framework is in place, regulation that is appropriate to the challenge that is being faced in the national context, and then also ensuring that that regulation can actually be enforced through the right mechanisms and programs. Many countries will have bilateral agreements in place that will also speak about recruitment across corridors, whether it's from the country of origin or the country of destination perspective. And also, governments need to address rapidly the changing nature of the migration landscape and also the challenges that are faced. And COVID-19 has certainly shown how quickly the recruitment landscape is impacted when we have a global health crisis. And we'll get to that in a moment. Employers, again, for them, recruitment is the key act of matching a vacant position with the worker with the right skill and knowledge level. Again, when recruiting across borders, employers also face information asymmetry. They don't know if the worker that they are recruiting is actually the worker that they need, and they trust recruitment agencies to fill that information gap for them. Employers can also face high costs when recruiting, and they need to match the skills to their needs. In terms of the recruitment agencies that are doing the recruitment, they also want to have in place the right government regulation and oversight in order to remove some uncertainties. When we talk to the big recruiters that are part of the World Employment Confederation, what they're really looking for is the right regulation and right enforcement to create a level playing field so that the good recruitment agencies, the recruitment agencies that are adhering to national laws and regulations, are not undercut by other actors not abiding by the law, and that those actors will be eliminated from the market. This also comes to the second bullet that I have on the screen, that is that when there is a duality in the market, it's an increasing cost of business for those actors that are trying to be fair. And then finally, the regulation needs to be the right sort of right set of regulations in terms of their heaviness, as too much regulation can also impede new actors or new actors that are trying to be fair labor recruiters who might start off smaller from entering the market. And we've seen that in some contexts, that the existing regulation in place sets such a high bar that small actors can actually not come in. So that's a little bit the general challenges I say we would be facing in the recruitment landscape. Of course, these challenges are different depending on the national context, depending on whether free movement protocols are in place, which might make movement a little bit more informal, and also depending on the bilateral agreements that countries have in place. So before I go on with my presentation, I actually wanted to pose a question to you, which is that how has COVID-19 affected recruitment practices across borders in your region, in your free movement regime region or bilaterally? So what I'd like to ask is that you take a moment to reflect on this past year and some of the trends in recruitment that you've seen. And you might start popping those in the chat group. Fernando, perhaps you can help me monitor a little bit as I'm sharing the screen, the chat group, and let's see what comes up. So I'll just give you a moment to reflect and start popping those in the chat. Thanks. And of course, you can respond in whichever language you're most comfortable in, and then we'll see what we can read out.
Okay, so we have a first one here. No, actually, that's from here. So we're still waiting for comments here in the chat box. So you can just write in the chat box now. Vous pouvez à ce moment-là écrire dans la. So we have here Peter Boyongo. He's saying that many businesses they were closed, and Theodora Estelle, I think she started writing, but she was not able to complete. Rinsalad Assap, with the national lockdown in South Africa and already with unemployed rates, recruitment has been incredibly slow. And a comment from Zanel Matebula. There has been a decrease in employment of migrant workers. And after Jane from Mauritius, for Mauritius, as far as I know, to be confirmed by Mr. Kupan, Indian workers continued to come in December 2020 to work on building our cancer hospital, but otherwise, boundaries closed for others. From Alice Brito, with COVID-19, space was open to work without observing the right mechanisms fixed by the government. There was a reduction in terms of opportunities of employment. Another comment, due to lockdown, borders are closed, work permits for expatriates were extended. Border closure that restricted movement. With COVID, we have seen a massive expelling of migrant workers, and and others in general. An important impact in the important reduction in the money transfer sent by immigrants to their orange countries. Increasing irregular migration. In some cases, there has been loss of benefits and unfair termination of contracts. A sharp drop of tourism, decrease in tourism as Southern Africa is a destination of tourists. Loss of employment. And migrant workers are not getting jobs as easily as before the pandemic.
Great, thanks, Fernando. I think
so now I have a lot of
yeah, there's a lot coming in, and I'm seeing them. It's really interesting what everyone has observed, and please continue to post as we discuss. I think there's lots of observations from your region that you have experienced and the new challenges that you are also facing. Let me turn back to my presentation. We have the ILO did a number of surveys on how the pandemic impacted recruitment of migrant workers and also migrant worker employment conditions. We did these surveys in the SADC region, in the IGAD region, and we're still finalizing some surveys in Northern Africa. But we also did surveys in Southeast Asia and South Asia, and we're pulling this into a global report that we'll launch next month that I hope will be transmitted to you as well. And it shows the scale of how migrant workers were impacted by the pandemic. And on my slide are just some of the headline findings, which I think you have also observed in your countries, as is evident by the contributions you're making in the chat box. So migrant workers suffered immense job losses across every region surveyed. In Nepal, which has around 2.5 to 3 million workers abroad, 25% of those workers had to be repatriated. Numbers are also striking in Thailand, where 700,000 migrant workers left. And if you can see on the quote as well that I put up, tens and thousands of migrant workers were stranded across Africa. And this, of course, has impacted the income migrant workers earn, the remittances that they are able to send home, the fact that many had to return before their contracts were finished, or some had to take unpaid leave, leaving them in the country of destination without any income to support their living costs or those of their families. One of you also mentioned that many workers paid high fees and then weren't able to travel. This is in fact something that we saw across all regions. Workers had already paid fees, some illegal, some legal, and costs, and were about to travel, and then were stopped from traveling and effectively put on hold their migration journey, but were unable to recuperate the fees already paid. So in fact, they were in debt and without a job to pay off that debt. Someone also said that the pandemic affected the businesses, and in fact that's very true of labor recruitment businesses as well, many of which are small business and often sort of left out of government subsidies. Some recruiters were able to provide their support to their recruits, so those workers that they had recruited, in terms of information dissemination, keeping in contact with them, whereas others weren't able to provide that follow-up support. The fact that travel restrictions were changing all the time severely impacted the recruitment industry in terms of income that they could earn, in terms of support they could provide to their employers that for looking for employees. In some instances, the demand for recruitment services completely collapsed because of the nature of the industry. Some of you mentioned tourism, for example. But in other low-wage sectors, actually demand increased. So I mentioned that a hotel was still being built. In fact, migrant workers were often at the front line, providing those essential services that were still needed during the heavy lockdown periods, whether that's healthcare, whether that's agriculture, whether that's construction. This is where migrant workers were most often employed. So we had a bit of a shift in the industry away from some sectors into others, and labour recruiters had to be there to respond. There were also ongoing logistical challenges for recruitment because of different modes of transport available, different COVID-19 procedures to ensure workers were safe, and so on. And finally, there are, of course, protection challenges for migrant workers that just were exacerbated by the pandemic. Some of you mentioned that in the chat as well as discrimination and xenophobia experienced by migrant workers, where some perceptions of migrant workers were that they were bringing the virus back into their country, and often that was no fault of their own. They had been exposed and not given access to proper quarantine procedures or PPE, and then they were repatriated and kept in quite crowded quarantine centers. So there is also this element. As I said, this report brings together some findings from across the world, and we should have this ready for you in a couple of weeks. Okay, so that's the challenge. That's a little bit the why of why we have ILO's work on fair recruitment. So I wanted to introduce you to our Fair Recruitment Initiative, some of its operations, and then some of the key guidance documents. So we have a Fair Recruitment Initiative in the ILO that's been ongoing since 2014, but the ILO has in fact been promoting standards and regulation of recruitment since its inception. And there's a whole history of how the ILO has promoted regulation of private employment agencies, which has changed over the years. But our Fair Recruitment Initiative aims to bring together the different labour market actors and look at how they can work together, how they can do their bit, and then how they can work together to promote fair recruitment of workers. So first of all, we do work on enhancing, exchanging, disseminating global knowledge. So like this COVID-19 brief is part of that assignment, as is the work on SDG 1071 that Jessie will introduce to you. That is our first pillar of work. Our second pillar of work is to improve laws, policies, and enforcement. So within that, we had the development of the ILO General Principles and Operational Guidelines. We promote ratification of relevant standards, and we work closely with national governments to amend their regulations and how they enforce them. And I have a few good practices at the end of the presentation. If we have time, we'll go over those. If not, they're there for you to read. Our pillar 3 is about promoting fair business practices, whether that's the business practice of the labour recruiter, the private employment agency themselves, or the hiring employer. We promote that employers do their due diligence on the recruitment agencies they work with, and that they should not be charging fees and costs to the worker, but rather be paying for those themselves or distributing the costs among the recruitment agency and the government. And finally, we have a pillar on empowering and protecting workers. So this is work around ensuring workers have access to trade union support services or civil society as appropriate, that they can be organized and represented, and that they can access services when needed, such as access to justice or support to access grievance mechanisms when things have gone wrong. And our overall strategy is grounded in the international labor standards, global guidance, as well as social dialogue between the actors of the labor market. We're now in our second phase. We'll be launching our second phase on April 8th, but it consists of this strategy. Our Fair Recruitment Initiative is operational globally. I have to say the work in Southern Africa with our constituents would be starting now with the SAMM Project. So I'm sure you'll be hearing lots from Jessie and Gloria on how we can launch the Fair Recruitment Initiative also in your region. But thus far, we're active in 30 countries around the world. And we also have a wide range of global products, guidance, etc., that will support rollout of the Fair Recruitment Initiative in different regions. So that's a little bit ILO's approach. Before I get into the details of the general principles, I just wanted to situate ourselves in terms of global guidance and international labor standards. So, I mean, this is kind of a hierarchy, but it's just to give you a framework of how different guidance should be taken into account. So first of all, we have the ILO Fundamental Conventions, including Convention 29 and its protocol that do speak to elimination of forced labor and sees fair recruitment as an integral part of eliminating forced labor. Then we also have specific standards. So the ILO Employment Instruments, Convention 88 regulates private employment public employment services, and Convention 181 speaks to the regulation of private employment agencies. Then we have the ILO migration specific conventions 143 and 97, which I think Miriam has just introduced to you. And then there's also guidance on regulation of recruitment in sectoral conventions, such as the Maritime Labour Convention, which looks also at the role of recruitment agencies in recruitment of seafarers, Convention 188, which is on recruitment of fishers, and Convention 189 on the recruitment of domestic workers. So those are the sectoral angle. Then we have tripartite negotiated guidance. I'll speak a little bit about how we develop the general principles and the ILO definition. And then there are really these operational strategies and tools. So that's the ILO's Fair Recruitment Initiative. There's also the IOM IRIS initiative, which looks at creating a standard for private employment agencies. There's the ITUC Migrant Recruitment Advisor, where migrant workers can rate their recruitment experience with a particular recruitment agencies. And then there are other multi-stakeholder initiatives, some of them employer-led, company-led, such as the ILO Business Network on labor. So that's a little bit the scene of different actors trying to promote fair. So let's dig into some of the ILO guidance. The ILO guidance consists of the general principles, operational guidelines, and the ILO definition of recruitment fees and costs. I hope Miriam will have put on your platform links to these documents. We also have short videos that explain them in a little bit more simple terms. So it'll only take you 5 minutes to get a good overview. These were developed through an ILO tripartite process. This means that our governing body has decided that this is an important area of work, and they want to pull together ILO experts from government, workers, and employers to discuss, debate, and negotiate. The office, so the ILO office headquarters, prepares background material and draft definition and a draft general principles and operational guidelines based on extensive research and consultation, and puts these forward to the experts. And the experts come together for 3 days of long negotiations, often into the middle of the night, to come up with discussions that all areas of the ILO constituents can endorse and work on and promote. So this is how the general principles and the definition came together. The objective of the ILO general principles is to inform the current and future work of the ILO, but also national constituents, policymaker, legislators, and social partners. They are derived from a number of ILO sources that I put on the screen previously. The idea is to bring these together into one document rather than governments or policymakers, experts having to go to different documents to see what they say on recruitment. The general principles bring these into one document. They cover the recruitment of all workers, so national recruitment as well as recruitment of migrant workers across borders. They also cover recruitment through temporary work agencies. That means that's when the agency actually remains the one holding the employment relationship and sort of places the worker into an employer, into a company, but the labor recruiter retains the status of employer. And they also apply to all sectors. And we say that the best way to start implementing these guidelines in your national context is to hold a tripartite consultation on what is relevant and what is needed given your national context. The general principles consist of two parts. There's a set of general principles, which I will introduce you to in a moment. They're intended to implement orientation at all levels. And then there are operational guidelines, which are much more specific, much more concrete, and address the responsibilities of different actors in the recruitment process, whether that's the government, the employer, the recruiter, or the public employment service. So if you're looking for specific guidance, this is the part of the general principles you want to look at. So what do general principles and operational guidelines guide us in? So first of all, how can we respect human and labor rights of migrant workers and national workers during the recruitment process? Excuse me. This is one of the fundamental principles of the general principles. Second, the general principles state that recruitment should respond to established labor market needs. That means that the worker is being recruited for an actual job rather than a job that's been perhaps made up. We've seen that happen a lot, and it leads to visa trading issues. And that the recruitment actually promotes a decent job that the worker is being recruited into. We say that a third principle is that recruitment laws and policies should apply to all workers, national, migrant, women, men, regardless of sex, age, disability, etc. So equality of treatment in recruitment laws and policies. Fourth, the general principles should support efficiency in recruitment, transparency of information to both the worker and the employer, and overall protection of workers. Fifth, recruitment policies and laws should be enforced, and that includes through labor inspection. So how can labor inspectors also take on the role of ensuring that workers have been recruited fairly, and how do labor inspectors actually also inspect recruitment businesses to ensure that they are complying with the laws? We have a few examples where this is happening quite effectively. Sixth, the general principles say that recruitment laws and policies should respect and enforce national laws and also collective agreements. In some contexts, recruitment is actually regulated through collective bargaining agreements. This is particularly the context of Scandinavian countries. Seventh, an important principle that we've been working on a lot that I introduced at the beginning is that no recruitment fees and costs should be charged to workers at any stage of the recruitment process. Eighth, workers should have access to clear and transparent employment contracts in a language that they understand. If they don't read, if they're not literate, the employment conditions should be read to them, and a copy of the employment contract should still be made available to them. Ninth, workers should be free from deception and coercion during the recruitment process. This links to Principle 7. When you have workers going into debt for a job, it's often linked to coercion in the recruitment process. 10th, workers should have access to free, comprehensive, and accurate information throughout the recruitment process, prior to departure, and also during employment and upon return. They should be able to change their employer and retain their identity documents. This is the 11th principle. The 12th is that they should be free to terminate their contract and return home when they have finished their contract or when they have terminated their contract. And finally, when things do go wrong, workers should have access to free dispute resolution and effective remedies. So this is the outline of the general principles. As I said, the operational guidelines go into much more detail on how to do this in principle. And I'm sure you'll have lots of questions around that. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into the general principles, as we also want to introduce the definition to you. So I will stop there. I think we'll address a lot of sort of practicalities during the question time. So in that sense, I'm going to hand over to Jessie to introduce you to the second part of the ILO guidance. Thanks a lot, Jessie.
Great, thank you very much, Heike. Can I just confirm that everybody can hear me?
Yes, the only thing is, Heike, you have to go off the share screen mode, so that
no, she'll continue to share the presentation.
Okay, perfect. Okay, sorry for that. So yeah, we can hear you very well. Just go
Wonderful,
ahead.
Thank you. Right, my name is Jessie Mertens. I work for the ILO in Lusaka. I'm part of the SAMM Project, which is organizing this training program. I focus mainly on labor migration and data issues, and I'll come back to the data aspect of recruitment fees and costs towards the end of the presentation. First, I'd like to just talk a little bit on continuing on Heike's presentation, focusing on a global study on recruitment fees and related costs, which was conducted by the ILO in 2018. I'm not going to go into too much detail. There's a lot of text on the slides. That's mostly for your reference. I'll just highlight a few key points to note, which is that in most cases, in 63% of the policies that were analyzed, the prohibition of fees for workers is the dominant policy approach. There are various different, I guess, approaches or frameworks that one could imagine when it comes to recruitment costs, shared burden or burden sharing, or the employer pays principle, for instance. And in principle, that is similar, although not completely overlapping with prohibiting fees for workers. A third of policies regulate the payment of recruitment fees and related costs by workers through general policy statements, putting caps on fees, itemizing which fees and costs can and cannot be charged to workers. Some countries have quite elaborate lists of what constitutes a recruitment fee or cost, though not everywhere is it as clearly itemized as in other countries. And it's not only among governments that the issue of regulating recruitment is an important and salient issue. In fact, there are very many international business multi-stakeholder initiatives which focus on providing guidance, voluntary guidance, if you will, to regulating recruitment within the business environment. So, for instance, there were a number of documents reviewed from mostly multinationals and these kind of multi-stakeholder initiatives, which do itemize costs and shows really that there is commitment outside of government and within the private sector for regulating recruitment and addressing the issues of exploitation of migrant workers at that stage. Okay, going on. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. I wanted to go a little bit more into the region after the global study and highlight some findings from two studies on fair recruitment in the Southern Africa region, in Lesotho and South Africa. In the case of Lesotho, a draft national labor migration policy has been developed, adopted by Cabinet just last month. And that identifies high levels of fraudulent recruitment practices and the inadequacy of the current regulatory system as arguments for strengthening recruitment regulation. So some of the good things of this policy is that it refers to the ILO's general principles and operational guidelines as a guiding framework. It addresses glaring gaps in the regulation of private employment agencies and provides means to help professionalize individual agencies. It's supportive of and includes the prevention of trafficking, smuggling, forced labor, and other forms of fraudulent recruitment. It supports improving coordination between the various units in charge of vetting contracts and helps provide pre-departure training and sensitization for migrant workers specific to each country of destination. Now, I guess one of the recurring questions or one of the recurring challenges in most countries is implementation, and it's the same here. One of the big challenges in this process has to do with the lack of coherence or the challenges in coherence between the Ministry of Labor and the Ministry of Home Affairs, as one of them controls work permits and the other controls entry visas and residence permits. So that coordination is something that together with enforcement of other kinds of regulations remains a challenge in many places. South Africa, on the other hand, has also developed a draft national labor migration policy, which is currently being revised and consultations are being held on it. In a white paper produced by the Department of Home Affairs on international migration for South Africa, there is a strong emphasis on developing adequate policies and implementation strategies for attracting, recruiting, and retaining international migrants. That requires looking at what types of skills are needed from abroad, closing skill gaps, and ensuring that there's transfer of skills between migrant workers and citizens. It does note that recruitment has been regulated through the existing Employment Services Act of 2014, which provides provisions for both the private sector as well as public employment services to act as a corollary, as a complement to the private sector. It also states very explicitly that no person may charge a fee to any work seeker for providing employment services to that work seeker. So it's even within the region, there's a lot of awareness and growing policy work on regulating recruitment, recognizing that the vulnerability of migrant workers doesn't start once they're in their job or once they're in their country of destination, but it starts already at the process of recruitment, of finding jobs, of engaging a recruiter and intermediary to help find that job. So from here, I'm going to slowly transition into the issue of recruitment costs. We've talked about the policy in general. Now, what are these costs that we're talking about? Because we keep on saying, costs and fees. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Again, a very full slide, but I'm going to try to walk you through it a little bit. There are, of course, as we all know, various stages of the recruitment process, and if you drill down into the details, you'll find that there are costs, multiple costs at all of these steps. So in terms of a worker collecting their documentation, you can think of obtaining passports, getting police clearances, birth certificates, skills certificates. Then there's all the medical certification that is required, pre-departure medical screenings, vaccinations, these kind of costs. Skills assessments as well as additional training can be a vocational skill test or even language competencies that need to be tested. There's costs associated with those. Often at the pre-departure stage, there is a briefing or a training, and in some cases that comes with costs. Origin country government requirements, such as contract approvals, welfare fund contributions, social security enrollment, and various other fees or taxes which might be required by the country of origin. Same in the country of destination, costs for obtaining visas, for obtaining work permits. Then there's the actual travel itself. There's internal travel from one's home to the airport or to government offices to obtain all that aforementioned documentation. There's the international travel, and then there's local transportation to and from the place of work in the country of destination. There could be various other costs: breach of contract, security deposits, administrative costs at the stations, legal fees, potentially even the cost of getting photographs. And then there's the cost of return travel, allowances potentially for return travel, or in some cases, and this falls under costs that actually may never be charged. You could even imagine fees or penalties for leaving a job before the end of the contract. Now that's, as I mentioned, one that we should be very wary of, because that should never be charged to a worker, regardless of any contractual or government requirements. So can we go to the next slide, please? All right, the definition of recruitment fees and related costs. This is a section of the general principles and operational guidelines. In fact, it is a complementary document which should be read together as one work. It outlines exactly what is meant when we say no fees or related costs should be charged to workers. It gets divided up into three large categories, one of which is recruitment fees, another one is related costs, and the last one, as I mentioned, which is illegitimate, unreasonable, or undisclosed costs. So recruitment fees, the first category, is the main category. It, of course, includes payments for recruitment services offered by public or private recruiters, payments made for recruitment working for a third party, so detachment in a sense. Payments made for direct recruitment by the employer, so even if there's no recruiter involved, those are still considered recruitment fees. And then any payments to recover recruitment fees from workers. So think of wage deductions or any other kinds of fees charged to the worker that have to do with recovering costs, whether that's one-time or recurring. Next slide, please. Related costs are as the name says, costs related to the recruitment process, but not necessarily an explicit recruitment fee. And here, as we'll see in just a minute, national legislations differ a little bit in how they interpret the responsibility for covering these costs. What I should mention is that the general principles and operational guidelines don't say that these costs shouldn't exist, just that a worker should not be held responsible for them. So, and recognizing that, there was a distinction made between the actual fees and other incidental or related costs, such as medical costs, insurance costs, skills and qualifications, certification, extra training and orientation, pre or post departure, equipment, lodging, administrative costs. So we're talking about, obtaining passports, obtaining visas, background checks, exit clearances, and various other documentation which is needed for a worker to obtain a job. Next slide, please. Finally, as I mentioned, the illegitimate, unreasonable, and undisclosed costs are the extra contractual, undisclosed, inflated, or illicit costs, which are never legitimate costs or fees to be charged to a worker. The definition encourages complying with anti-bribery and anti-corruption regulations at national levels at any and all times of the recruitment process. And some examples could include bribes, tributes, extortion or kickback payments, illicit cost recovery fees, and collaterals required by anybody along the recruitment chain. So one example I could give to make this a little bit more tangible is, for instance, in several cases we have heard of recruitment agencies providing a kind of a pre-departure training as an extra service, which is an extra service, but not really voluntary. One has to have this training in order to be eligible for the recruitment agency to put them forward for a job. But it turns out that the substance of this training is often very limited, if not non-existent, and it is simply a covert way of charging an extra fee or a fee to a worker for the service that they're getting. So that is an example.
Voilà, c'est un exemple du type de coût non légitime.
De contenu
Prochaine transparence, s'il vous plaît.
Pour les migrants.
Sorry, just 1 second.
Juste une seconde.
Is reporting that the French channel there's double interpretation.
On a 2 voix sur le canal français.
I think it's sorted now. Please
Ça va
continue,
maintenant?
Jess.
Okay, will do. Just want to very quickly show you one.
Je vous montre.
A global database of laws and policies at national level and the definitions of fees and costs at national level. So it's on the ILO website, developed on the back of this 2018 study, a global study done on recruitment policy as well as recruitment fees and costs. And it allows you to get a global overview of where this kind of work is being done and what the differences are between countries. And I'll show you just a few short examples of how different countries define recruitment fees and costs and the responsibilities for paying for those. So if we can go to the next slide. And again, a lot of text. I'll go through it rather superficially, and then you can refer to it, back to it in the slides in your own time. So 2 examples of origin countries which have policies on recruitment and recruitment fees. The first, Ethiopia, which has ratified the Convention on Regulating Private Recruitment Agencies, finds that employers are responsible for paying such costs as the visa fee, international travel, so the ticket costs, residence and work permits, and various other fees, including insurance coverage. Whereas workers are held responsible in national legislation to cover the costs of verification documents such as police clearances and medical clearances, obtaining their own passports, birth certificates, skills certification, occupational competence certificates, which shows that at national level, implementation of principles and guidelines differs. Not always will a country be in a position to immediately eliminate all fees being charged to workers, and in some cases, the frameworks, the idea behind the framework is that there are incidental costs which would have applied to anybody, including a migrant worker, and hence they can be expected to pay for things such as passports and medical clearances. Philippines is somewhat similar, although they allow a recruitment fee charged to workers of not more than 1 month of that worker's, the equivalent of 1 month's salary, with a few exceptions. Notably, domestic workers may not be allowed, may not be charged recruitment fees, and workers going to countries where the charging of such fees is illegal may also not be charged. So there is that sensitivity to other countries' legislations, which is helps make this policy rather responsive. Workers, again, here have to pay for passports and verification documentation mostly, medical certificates, police clearances rather, while employers are responsible for paying for visa fees, work and residence permits, round-trip airfare, overland transportation, and then any other of the POEPA, the Philippine Overseas Employment Administration fees, as well as the Overseas Workers Welfare Administration fees. So those are 2 origin countries. If we go to the next slide. we'll see 2 destination countries. Qatar, which has recently revised its recruitment system and replaced its kafala system with an employment permit system, states quite explicitly that workers may not be charged any fees, including through wage deductions, for processing fees, visa costs, accommodation, food and transportation, training, medical insurance, and prescribed healthcare. Now, of course, I guess you can say the devil is in the details. We'd have to see how this gets implemented in practice to see whether any of these regulations in destination countries lead to measurable improvements in outcomes for migrant workers, which we'll look at in the next few slides. Finally, last example is that of the UK, which has quite strong regulation through the Gangmasters Act. The employer pays essentially for, well, the worker does not pay for any costs. Employers are responsible for processing fees, pre-departure certification, documentation and verification, which includes the passports and medical and police clearances, which in other countries are charged to workers, transit costs, arrival costs, costs that arise during employment, and importantly also any costs that arrive after employment or upon taking early leave. So no fees or deductions can be charged for workers as penalties for termination either. So those are some examples of how fees and costs are defined in national contexts. I think what I'd like to do now is look at how we start to measure some of the recruitment costs that happen in practice. Can we go to the next slide? Right. So we're going to take a very short moment now, if you don't mind, Miriam, if we can go to the question. What we're talking about next is how to measure recruitment costs. If you've been paying attention so far, you'll know that recruitment costs for migrant workers should add up to 0. But we know that in practice, that's not the case. And it would help policymakers to get a look into the details of where costs are highest and hopefully why costs are high in certain contexts in order to most effectively address those costs. So what I'd like to ask everybody in the call, is to give me an estimate of how many months you think the average migrant worker in your country has to work to repay their recruitment costs. That is to say, think of it as a share of their monthly salary. Would they have to work for half a month, for 1 month, for 2 months, for 20 months to repay the costs that they had made to get their job abroad?
You can use, it's exactly the same Slido link that we used in the first session. So you can go back to it or with your phone, slido.com, #SAMM with M 2021.
You can see also the details here in the chat, both the website to go and the hashtag to enter to be able to access the survey.
Jesse, you tell me when you want to stop. Just for your information, have a look as well to the chat box for the participants who are that struggling to get access to Slido. We do also have some comments in the chat box.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, maybe we can give it just a few more seconds. And maybe while we're waiting for this to populate, I can already start to reflect on some of the outcomes a little bit. I see, well, quite similar to the outcomes of a lot of the studies that we've done, an incredibly broad range of estimates, ranging from anywhere between 0 or 3 months to 48 months, 60 months, in fact. Well, let's focus on that 48 for a second. Some people have said 12 to 24. 48 months equates to 4 years worth of work. That would mean a person has to work without any extra income for 4 years to repay the cost of getting a job. That, I mean, I wouldn't do that. And I don't think anybody else here would either, nor would agree that that's something that should be expected. Even 12 to 24 months, 6 to 12, 9 months are a very long time to have to work without any other income, just to repay the upfront cost of finding a job abroad. Interestingly, this really broad range of answers also reflects the differences between countries and within countries when we've done studies. And I'll show you a little bit more details in just a moment, which show that it depends very strongly on the specific corridor, from what country to what country one is going to, whether one pays more or less recruitment costs. It depends a lot on the occupation. It can even depend, in many cases, on the gender of the person going. So keep in mind that these are very, very high numbers that we're seeing in this Slido. And sadly, sometimes they do come quite close to the truth. So perhaps we can go back to the presentation and look a little bit at how we have done some studies and what we've measured through the SDG recruitment indicator. So I think we can go to slide 25. Thank you. The ILO and World Bank are the co-custodians for SDG indicator 10.7.1, which looks at recruitment costs borne by an employee as a proportion of monthly income earned in their country of destination. That is to say, the number that you've been putting down in the Slido, a ratio between a cost and an income. The way the SDGs are defined, statistics should represent the experiences of all international migrant workers and could and should be recognized as official national statistics, something that you might get alongside employment rates or unemployment rates from a labor force survey, for instance. It's quite technical, but statistics should be based on cost and earnings observed for the same individuals, making it possible to calculate mean values and various disaggregations for costs and earnings distributions. So when we first started to do this work, we had done a number of pilot studies through the World Bank Nomad initiative, very small scale studies to kind of pilot the idea. And that already showed us a very, very wide disparity of costs, ranging from anywhere between about 1 to 2 months up to, in one egregious case, 11 to 12 months of work to repay recruitment costs in one particular corridor. Since we have expanded the methodology for this work, so we have started looking at how to collect more representative statistics in order to make sure that we're not just looking at a very select group of workers. And before we go into that, if we can go to the next slide, I would like to point out that even though for an SDG indicator, we want to simplify it to one number, we want to look at the number of months a worker has to pay to repay their recruitment costs, we have to keep in mind that the cost of migration to a worker is not just about their wage. It's also about deficiencies in working conditions, and we need to be aware of those as well. So as a prelude to looking at recruitment costs, there was a study done through the NOMAD initiative by some of our colleagues in the ILO, which looks at the impact of non-decent working conditions as a cost, translated into a monetary cost, if you will. So looking at contractual status, wages and timing of payments, hours worked, occupational safety and health, discrimination, trade union involvement. These are all areas which migrant workers report substantial shortfalls in compared with what you would expect under decent work. Just some examples, 24% of migrant workers experience losses due to wage issues, so late wage payment or non-payment of wages. 30% of all surveyed migrant workers didn't have a contract prior to departure, which contributes to their vulnerability upon arrival, because by that point, what position are you in to reject a contract that you're offered? And 25% of migrant workers reported not having any rest day per week. So if you were to convert that, for example, into number of over hours worked, and the same with all the other working conditions, we find that losses due to decent work deficits for migrant workers can represent up to 27% of their total actual wages, and in some cases can be twice as high as recruitment and travel costs, just to show you that when we're measuring recruitment costs as a share of monthly income, that does not include any of the losses or any of the costs borne by the worker due to decent work deficits. So with that caveat, next slide, please. Just a little bit of the history of how we came about measuring migration costs and recruitment fees. We've been trying for quite some time to get more accurate estimates of numbers of migrant workers. So the ILO's global estimates has been published since 2015, which finds at the moment there are about 164 million migrant workers worldwide, about 14.4 million in Africa, and about, let's say, 5 million in Southern Africa. After that, the statistics community, the International Conference of Labor Statisticians, produced guidelines in 2018 concerning statistics of labor migration, which provide guidance to statistical offices and other institutions that collect data on migration, on labor migration specifically, to collect comparable statistics on labor migration. And the methodology for testing and measuring SDG 10.7.1 on recruitment costs falls in line with that guidance. So it's very simple to supplement the guidance with questions on recruitment costs. And then for the past 5 or 6 years, we have been together with the World Bank piloting surveys of labor migration and recruitment costs. As I said, based on small sample sizes, which finds that anywhere between 1 and 11 work months have to be worked to repay recruitment costs. So next slide, please. Using the methodology we have developed for producing data under the SDG indicator, we have done a number of surveys in Bangladesh, Vietnam, Ghana, Mexico, and in Lao PDR, although that wasn't strictly following the methodology. It was part of a labor force survey module, which allows for similar kinds of comparisons. Next slide, please. And here we finally come to some of the meat of these surveys. A lot of the data is still quite preliminary, but what I wanted to show you is the table on the right, which very roughly puts together these various surveys and shows the huge disparities in costs that you can find. In Laos, for instance, costs were less than 1 month's wage for most workers. In Ghana, you find up to about 2 months wage as the cost of recruitment. Vietnam, it builds up to around 8.7 work months to repay recruitment costs. Slight variation between men and women, but I believe it's 9 months for men and about 6 months for women. But when you look at Bangladesh, you see that there is an extremely high recruitment cost indicator, which is here it goes up to 19. I think the average is about 17.5 work months to repay recruitment costs. And when you disaggregate between men and women, you find men paying up to 19 work months, whereas women pay between 5 and 7 work months. That's across all occupations and across all sectors and across all corridors, most importantly. Previous pilots have found that these high recruitment costs tend to come from specific corridors. So it's the specific combination of origin country and destination country that can lead to very high recruitment costs, even if the same job done in another country might not incur as high costs. And that might be reflective of existing migration flows or of agreements between countries that facilitate movement. So as I said, migration corridors matter. High cost items vary by origin country as well. There can be countries with extremely high visa costs compared to other origin countries which don't charge as much for the same categories. Gender matters, as I mentioned in the case of Bangladesh. High recruitment costs do not necessarily reflect high wage differentials between origin and destination countries. So you might imagine that workers would be more willing to go to a country where wages are higher for the same job than in another destination country. That does not influence the recruitment costs as much as one might expect. There are hidden costs that arise due to varying working conditions by occupation. And one very interesting but difficult to measure item is that loans can increase migration costs. So a worker taking out a loan in order to be able to afford paying all of the upfront costs that a recruiter might be requiring adds to their debt burden, adds to the repayments that they have to do monthly, which takes away from what they're left with on their monthly income after having repaid recruitment costs. So in a very short nutshell, those are some indications of the differences of recruitment costs. And as a policymaker, you can already start to see where the most urgent need for intervention is. I guess I can just end by saying that the SAMM Project is here to support the participating countries in strengthening their labor migration statistics, and that includes support in collecting information on recruitment costs through SDG 10.7.1. Whether that is through the SAMM Project or through some of the other ILO initiatives, there is a possibility to provide support in collecting this data at a national level. So on that note, I'm going to end my talk. 12:30, right on time. I hope the moderators will be able to build in a little extra time for questions. Back to you, Fernando.
Okay, thank you very much, Jess. So I think you have time for a couple of questions now, and I see that Heike has already started answering a couple of them through the chat, mostly in English. So I would suggest now that maybe Heike could summarize a little bit the answers she gave, so that we have the chance to translate that to French and Portuguese as well. And if you have more questions, please feel free to write in the chat box now, and you'll try to address it.
Sure, I think that's a good idea, so everyone can hear. We had a question from Jane asking to elaborate on what freedom from deception and incursion means. It means that workers should be free to agree to the terms and conditions of their employment, that they can do so voluntarily, and that they're not forced to accept certain conditions. And what I added is that when workers have a big debt to pay to their recruiter, they are more likely, well, they are less free to reject or accept certain conditions because they have this huge debt burden that they're thinking about. In many instances, workers actually put forward family collateral to pay for their migration, whether that's a small plot of land or an asset such as a motorbike. So they face a lot of pressure to pay back that money. And when they have that pressure, they're more forced into accepting conditions of work that we wouldn't describe as decent. So that's what it means to be free from coercion and deception, to not be forced to accept certain conditions. There was a really interesting question on medical costs. Does this include isolation costs related to containment of COVID-19, like these quarantine costs? And so what I explained in my answer was that, of course, the definition was negotiated before COVID-19, and we didn't really predict a pandemic when that was being negotiated. So we didn't factor in these sort of extra crisis related costs. But exact extract from the definition, I put it there. It's payments for medical examination, tests, or vaccinations. So vaccinations is already there. It's very clear. It would include COVID-19 vaccinations. And then I also explained that the general spirit of the definition is to reduce the costs that workers pay. And the experts said that the definition is not exhaustive, that it might need to be adjusted to national circumstance, and indeed adjusted to global circumstance when it comes to COVID-19. And the experts also negotiated a chapeau, a little introduction, which says that when initiated by an employer, a labor recruiter, or an agent acting on behalf of those parties, when required to secure access to employment or emplacement, and when imposed during the recruitment process, then a cost should be considered part of the related to recruitment and not charged to the worker. So if quarantine is a requirement in this recruitment process, then I do believe that cost should be absorbed by the government or the employer or the recruiter, not the worker. So those are the two questions I responded to in writing. There was a question about multinational companies in Mozambique that are recruiting for mineral and gas exploration. And in South Africa, mining companies recruit large amounts of Mozambican labor for South African mines, but it appears that most immigrant workers are recruited by traditional methods outside recruitment agencies. Our recruitment agency services designed to accommodate the need of large corporate or multinational companies. Okay, I think this is a very interesting question, actually. I think recruiters often make money based on scale. You know, when they can set up in a country of origin and meet the needs of a country of destination employer, And obviously they get paid per worker employed. So when they can recruit a higher volume of workers for a company, this is an attractive business market for them. So that might be one element coming into why a recruiter sets up in a certain corridor. Another one is perhaps large companies, large multinational companies that need a large amount of workers wouldn't have the internal capacity of their HR departments to recruit thousands of workers, and therefore outsource that business to a recruitment agency. So that might be another reason why the private recruiters are coming in. And then also there is this element of information asymmetry. This company operating in Mozambique might rely on a private recruiter to fill the information gaps as to what skills, knowledge, skilled workers are available in other countries. And the recruitment agency might know that national market more than the multinational company operating in Mozambique, so they'll rely on the international recruiter. Another factor that I think plays into the South African model is history, context, bilateral agreements, and borders. I think, if you look at a country, well, a region such as the Arab states, they're recruiting from workers that have to fly in. Workers can't just cross the border and come into Qatar. They have to fly in from Bangladesh, Nepal, Kenya, etc. So it's not as simple just to cross the border. That's one. And then there's also the factor of free movement agreements. We see this a lot in West Africa. There's not a huge market for private employment agencies in West Africa because workers can simply cross a border due to free movement in ECOWAS and then look for a job. And they might do that by going to a friend who has a job in the country of destination, or a village chief who has a connection, or some social media links. So there, private recruiters have less of a comparative advantage. Private employment agencies have less of a comparative advantage, and why there's still reliance on these traditional social networks, let's say. So I think that's my response there. Jesse, do you want to take the next one or add anything I've said?
Yeah, I guess. Thank you, Heike. That was pretty comprehensive. I just wanted to add that even in the absence of recruitment agents, of a recruitment industry, whether it's traditional methods or open borders, the general principles also apply to large corporations or multinational companies that are hiring migrant workers. So you could argue that these same guidelines and principles apply to them when they're even when they're going through traditional methods. And there you come back to the issue of enforcement and implementation, whether it is within the national system's capacity to actually enforce these protections with informal recruitment agencies or informal brokers, which is, of course, a huge challenge, especially in places where you have open borders and where recruitment is not such a regulated process. What was the next question? Could you help refresh my memory? Or are there any further questions?
I think we don't have more questions so far. So maybe if someone would like to raise the hand or to ask a question through video, that's a possibility as well. So please, if it's the case, you can just turn your mic on and ask the question directly. Otherwise, I guess we could finish the session. So let's just wait a few seconds to see if we have more people who would like to ask questions. But I guess apparently, I think we don't have anything else.
I have an announcement at the very end, but I'm happy to wait for 1 or 2 minutes for a question. Thanks.
It looks like the participants, they are happy with your explanations, and they were very detailed indeed. So I think maybe you can go ahead with your announcement, Heike.
So what I'd like to announce is that we will have a global forum on responsible recruitment in April. It's hosted together with the IOM and the Institute for Human Rights and Business. It will run over 4 days, and we will have 4 sessions each day, digging into different aspects of recruitment. So if this has been an interesting session for you and you'd like to hear from practitioners, experts around the world and from different stakeholders, we'll try to bring in lots of business perspective, workers' organization perspective, government regulatory perspectives. Please feel free to register. Hopefully Miriam can pop the link into the chat group. Once you're registered, you can choose which sessions you want to attend. I know 4 days of virtual meetings is a lot, but if you want to just listen to one agenda item, you can. 2 you can, 3 you can. You can design the 4 days in accordance with your time. So please take a look, register, and then pick the agenda items you'd like to join us on. The page itself, the website itself, will have a lot of interesting information. You'll be able to look at different resources from different organizations. So even if you don't manage to attend the live panel sessions, maybe there are some interesting resources for you to explore after you've registered. So that was my exciting announcement. I hope you will join us. It's shaping up to be quite an interesting event with participants from all over the world. So that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for your announcement, Heike, and for both of you for the great presentation. And now we're going to have few announcements. But before that, I would like to quickly ask you to do one thing. That normally when we have face-to-face courses, we do a group photo. That's and we have been trying to do something similar here with online courses. So we have right now almost 9 people here online. So I would like to ask you to very briefly to turn your cameras on if you are able to, and I'm going to capture your image. So like that, we are going to be able to in the end to put all faces together and have something close to a group photo. So you can remember the training and see also the faces of your colleague participants. So I see that people, they're turning the cameras on now, and I will just wait a few more seconds to...
I jump in and I ask also our colleague, the interpreters, who are the backbone of our courses, to join us. Without them, this exercise would be futile.
Exactly, they are very important, a very important component. Yeah, it's very nice to see all those faces. So I wait like a few more seconds, and after I actually have to capture several print screens because
yes,
exactly. But after we're going to put everything together and make it a big image. So okay, so 10 more seconds, and I will capture. Okay, so let's do it now. 1, 2. Almost done. Very good, very good. Thank you very much. So, and now I'm going to hand over to Hisham. He is going to remind you about details related to the campus platform, and also a few announcements regarding the next session. So, Hisham, up to you.
Thank you, Fernando. Thank you, everybody, for this amazing session. I'm going to mute everybody sorry, just briefly. So again, just a quick reminder, because there's been a lot of questions regarding the presentations. So all presentations, all documents are going to be available on the platform in the 3 languages. So as soon as they are ready, for example, today's presentations are already available, will be already available. Well, they are already available on the platform, but you will be able to access the platform as of this afternoon. So what's going to happen is you will be receiving a detailed email with your login credentials, how to log in onto the platform, how to change your password, and it also includes some videos on how to log in, as well as how to navigate the platform and where to find all the information. So as of today, this afternoon, you'll be able to access the platform where you find the information that we listed earlier. You also find reminders for the upcoming webinars, which is essentially every day from 8 to 11:30 Pretoria time. In the messages, you saw a bit of a let's call it a graph which shows what time would be locally for you, so you can refer to that. So we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. And I think as far as yes, please look forward to the email, the massive email that you'll be receiving today. And if you have any issues, concerns, you can always get back to us at migration@itcilo.org. And I think that would be it for today. I'll give the floor back to Miriam if you want to say goodbye to everybody, but I think we're done, Fernando.
Yeah, just one point that I always like to emphasize is that when I see this list of participants and I just saw the faces of everybody here, one thing that's also that's very important is besides learning from like the content of the course and from the experts that are here, there is a huge potential also for learning from each other. So I'm sure that you have a lot of experience and complementary experiences in the topic. So we would like to encourage you to, as much as possible, to try to know more about the other people, who they are, and try to engage in conversations through the forum, that the virtual cafe that you have in the campus, and also to try to establish connections. Those are people that they can become future references for you to keep connected and to keep learning from in the future. So that's it's a very important point that I think it's there is a lot of potential in this aspect of learning from each other here in this course. So that's just a reminder.
Thank you very much, Fernando. If I may just add some last words before we close. I fully agree with you. You know, as we mentioned, the eCampus would really be the base for your online training. So we can tomorrow morning, maybe Isham, just before we start the session as such, very briefly go again a second times, you know, on the eCampus. And by then you will have access and you will have received the email for connecting. Any issues, write to migration@itcilo.org, and we will help you to solve it. So let's meet again tomorrow. So 9 a.m. Pretoria time. So we will also maybe put on the campus, Isham, you know, the table you prepared, so you know what time is it at your place. So 9 a.m. to Pretoria time. I was about to say Turin time. No, Pretoria time. Let me thank, of course, again, Jesse and Heike for their presentation and for their time, and of course the whole SAMM team, Ilo SAMM team behind as well the course. And we will then see you tomorrow 9 a.m. Pretoria time. Just please be on time, so we are sure as well to start on time. And you will also have, because some are asking about the list of participants. The list of participants will be on the eCampus as well. Everything will be on the eCampus. Okay. Have a good day, evening, afternoon, depending where you stay, and see you tomorrow. Bye.